The quiet beginning. The city lights shimmered against the tinted glass as the car moved slowly through the crowded streets of Los Angeles. Inside, Keanu Reeves sat quietly, his eyes focused on the world outside. People walking fast, talking loud, living moments they might forget tomorrow. Beside him sat Sandra Bullock, her head resting gently against the window, her breathing calm and even. They were not lovers, not exactly strangers, but something in between. Two souls bound by time, fame, and a silent understanding that went beyond words. They were traveling together to a charity event in Santa Barbara, a few hours away. The car ride was supposed to be simple, just another journey in a long list of appearances, interviews, and scheduled smiles. But neither of them knew that this trip would change something deep inside them. For the first hour, the car was filled with light conversation. Sandra spoke about a rescue dog she had recently adopted, and Keanu listened with a quiet smile. He always admired her warmth, the way she cared about small things in a world that often celebrated noise. But behind her laughter, he sensed a tiredness. It wasn't from the journey or the lights. It was something older, heavier. As the night deepened, the highway stretched endlessly ahead. The driver turned on the soft jazz playing through the speakers. The rhythm was gentle, like the sound of a slow heartbeat. Sandra leaned back, her eyelids growing heavy. Keanu noticed but said nothing. He only shifted slightly to make sure she was comfortable. Minutes later, her head tilted to the side and rested softly on his shoulder. For a second, Keanu froze. Not because it was awkward, but because it was peaceful. It had been a long time since anyone had leaned on him like that. Without fear, without expectation, without reason. Just trust, the kind that asked for nothing in return. He looked at her, her face half lit by the soft glow of passing streetlights. The lines of fatigue on her face told stories of silent battles, the kind no one applauded her for. And for the first time in many months, Keanu felt something move inside him, a warmth that reminded him he was human before he was a star. Outside, rain began to fall lightly. Drops ran down the windows like streaks of silver. The sound was soothing. Sandra shifted slightly, mumbling something in her sleep, her fingers brushing against his sleeve. Keanu glanced at her again and then at the window, where his reflection stared back, calm, lonely, and lost in thought. His mind drifted to the past, to the days when he had learned the meaning of loss. He remembered the people he had loved and lost, the quiet nights when he sat alone with the weight of memory pressing on his chest. Yet now, as Sandra's head rested on his shoulder, the loneliness didn't hurt the same way. It felt softer, lighter, like it had found company. An hour passed. The car's rhythm was steady, the sound of rain growing louder. Suddenly, a flash of lightning lit the sky, followed by thunder that rolled like a drum across the horizon. The driver slowed down, squinting through the windshield. "The road ahead looks slippery, sir," the driver said, his voice calm but alert. Keanu nodded. "Take your time," he replied softly. "No rush." He glanced again at Sandra, who was still asleep, her breathing slow and steady. He gently adjusted the jacket on her shoulders so she wouldn't feel cold. The warmth of the gesture surprised even him. He hadn't realized how much he had missed taking care of someone. After a while, the rain became heavier. The road began to blur under the headlights. Keanu looked ahead, his instincts alert. Something about the darkness felt strange, too quiet, too still. The driver leaned forward, trying to see better. Then, it happened. A sharp screech echoed through the night. The car jerked slightly to the right. Through the rain, a truck suddenly appeared from the opposite direction, swerving uncontrollably. The driver hit the brakes hard. Tires screeched, and the world seemed to tilt for a moment. Keanu's arm moved on instinct, wrapping around Sandra to steady her as the car stopped just in time. The truck skidded past them, missing by inches before vanishing into the rain. The silence that followed was deafening. Sandra woke up with a jolt, her eyes wide. "What happened?" she whispered. "A truck lost control," Keanu said quietly. "But we're fine." She looked at him, her heartbeat racing. Her head was still resting on his shoulder, his hand still gently on her arm. For a brief second, their eyes met, a flash of raw, unguarded emotion between two people who had seen too much of life, and yet, in that moment, found something simple and real. The driver apologized from the front seat. Keanu smiled faintly. "No harm done," he said. "Let's just drive slow." As the car moved again, Sandra stayed awake this time. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of what they both felt but didn't say. Sometimes, the closest connection is the one that needs no words. Keanu turned his gaze back to the window. The reflection of the raindrops danced across his face. Deep inside, something told him that this night, this quiet moment, wasn't just an accident. It was a beginning, a quiet one, but powerful enough to stir memories he thought he had buried long ago. Sandra glanced at him, her voice soft. "Thank you," she said. He turned, a small smile touching his lips. "For what?" "For being there," she replied. "Even when you didn't have to." He didn't answer. He just nodded slightly, eyes back on the road. But inside, her words echoed louder than the thunder outside, and somewhere between the rain, the silence, and the road that stretched ahead, two hearts began to heal, without even realizing it. The road after the storm, the morning sun broke through the gray clouds as the car approached Santa Barbara. The night's rain had washed everything clean, and the wet road glistened like glass under the pale light. Keanu sat quietly, his eyes half closed, lost in the rhythm of the moving car. Beside him, Sandra stirred awake, rubbing her eyes slowly. For a moment, she looked confused, then remembered everything, the storm, the truck, and how she had fallen asleep on his shoulder. She sat up straight, embarrassed. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice soft. "I didn't mean to." Keanu smiled lightly. "It's okay. You were tired." "Still," she said, looking down. "I must have been out for hours." He shrugged gently. "Maybe you needed it." There was silence again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was peaceful, like they both understood something unspoken. The driver slowed as they entered the small coastal town. Palm trees lined the road, swaying lightly in the breeze. The ocean shimmered in the distance, waves rolling softly against the shore. Sandra rolled down her window, breathing in the fresh sea air. It smelled of salt and sunlight, a reminder that life still had calm places even after storms. "You ever wonder," she said suddenly, "how small moments can change everything?" Keanu glanced at her. "All the time," she smiled faintly. "Last night, when that truck came out of nowhere, I don't know. It made me think how fragile everything is, how fast it can all disappear." Keanu nodded, his voice quiet. "That's what makes it real." His words hung in the air, simple but heavy with meaning. The car pulled into the hotel driveway. Photographers were already there, waiting, flashes ready, lenses pointed. Sandra sighed. "And here we go again," she whispered. Keanu looked at her with a small, knowing smile. "Showtime." As they stepped out, the noise exploded. Questions flew, lights flashed, voices called out their names. Sandra smiled politely, waving to the cameras. Keanu, as always, stayed calm and composed, answering only when he had to. But under the surface, he hated this part. The noise, the pretending, the way real moments got buried under the need to perform. Inside the hotel lobby, the noise faded. The marble floors gleamed and soft music played from hidden speakers. Sandra stopped near the elevator and turned to him. "You hate all this, don't you?" He looked surprised. "What makes you think that?" "Your eyes," she said. "They always look somewhere else when the cameras flash." He gave a quiet laugh. "Maybe I'm just looking for something real." Her smile faded a little, replaced by something softer. "Me too." The elevator doors opened and they stepped inside. For a few seconds, there was only silence, the kind that felt warm, not empty. In the evening, the charity event began. The hall was filled with people dressed in shining clothes, talking loudly, laughing easily. Chandeliers sparkled above them, and the air smelled of perfume and money. Sandra moved through the crowd gracefully, greeting old friends, smiling for photos. Keanu stayed near the edge, quietly observing. He wasn't bored. He was just distant. It was how he protected himself, by staying a few steps away from the noise. After an hour, he stepped outside onto the balcony. The view took his breath away. The ocean stretched endlessly, the sunset painting the water gold and pink. He leaned on the railing, closing his eyes for a moment. Then he heard footsteps behind him. "Hiding already?" Sandra's voice teased gently. He smiled without turning around. "Not hiding, just breathing." She walked closer and stood beside him. The wind caught her hair, and for a moment, she looked almost unreal, like a scene from one of their old films. "You know," she said, "people keep asking if we'll ever do another movie together." "What do you tell them?" he asked. "I tell them I'd love to," she said, glancing at him, "but only if it means more than just acting." Keanu turned to her, curious. "What do you mean?" She looked at the horizon, her voice low. "Something that feels real. Like last night. Like the way you didn't say anything when I fell asleep. You just let it be." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said softly, "Maybe real doesn't need words." She smiled. "Maybe not." For a while they stood there in silence, the waves crashing far below. It was simple, yet full of something they couldn't name. Not romance, not friendship, but a quiet respect that felt deeper than either. When they finally went back inside, the hall had changed. A young boy, maybe 12, was on stage speaking about how the charity had helped rebuild his school after a flood. His voice trembled, but his eyes shone with courage. Sandra's eyes softened as she watched him. Keanu could see she was deeply moved. When the boy finished, she clapped first, louder than anyone else. And in that moment, Keanu realized something. Kindness was her strength, just like silence was his. Together, they balanced each other in ways words could never explain. As the night ended, they walked out together. The crowd was still talking, laughing, but they didn't notice. The world felt smaller, quieter, and somehow more meaningful. Before heading to their rooms, Sandra turned to him. "Thank you again." "For yesterday," he smiled. "You've already thanked me." "I know," she said softly. "But some things deserve to be said twice." He didn't reply. He just looked at her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable but gentle. As she walked away down the corridor, Keanu stood there, watching her go. The echo of her footsteps faded slowly, leaving only the hum of silence. He didn't fully understand it yet, but something inside him had shifted. Not loud, not sudden, but steady, like a tide changing direction. That night, as he sat by the window looking at the ocean, he realized he wasn't thinking about the past for once. He was thinking about tomorrow. The silence between them, the morning air was cool and still when Keanu stepped out of the hotel. The sun had barely risen, and the streets were quiet except for the soft sound of waves in the distance. He liked mornings like this. No cameras, no noise, no expectations. Just peace. He sat on a bench near the boardwalk, sipping a cup of black coffee. Gulls flew overhead, and the smell of salt filled the air. He was lost in thought when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "You always wake up this early?" He turned and saw Sandra standing there, wearing a gray hoodie and holding her own coffee. Her hair was tied back and her face looked fresh, without the layer of perfection people expected from her. "Most days," he said with a small smile. "I like the quiet." She sat beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "Quiet's nice," she said, "but it gets lonely sometimes." Keanu looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "It does." They both sat in silence, watching the waves. For a while, neither spoke, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was soft, full of unspoken things they both understood. After a few minutes, Sandra said, "You know, last night I couldn't stop thinking about that boy on stage. The one talking about the flood." Keanu turned slightly. "He was brave?" "Yeah," she said, looking down at her coffee. "It reminded me of something. When I was his age, my family had to move after a storm destroyed our home. I remember my mother crying, my father trying to stay strong. I learned early that life doesn't wait for you to be ready. It just happens." Keanu listened quietly. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer comfort, just listened. And somehow that was enough. "What about you?" she asked softly. "What were you like at that age?" He looked out toward the horizon. "Quiet, curious, maybe a little lost." "Lost?" she repeated. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "I lost someone close to me when I was young. It changes how you see things, makes you appreciate small moments more. She turned her head slightly, studying his face. There was no sadness in his eyes, just depth, like an ocean that had seen too many storms, but still remained calm. "You ever get tired of being strong all the time?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Every day." She looked away, her expression softening. "Me too." The sound of the ocean filled the silence again. The wind picked up slightly, blowing her hair across her face. Keanu reached out gently and tucked a loose strand behind her ear. It was a small gesture, almost instinctive, but it said more than words could. Sandra didn't move away. Instead, she smiled softly. "You really are different, you know that?" He raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Most people talk too much," she said. "You listen. It's rare." He chuckled quietly. "Maybe I just don't have much to say." "No," she said. "You say more by saying less." They both smiled, and for a moment the world felt lighter. Later that afternoon, they had a scheduled visit to a local art center that the charity supported. It was a small, colorful place run by volunteers who helped children learn painting, music, and theater. As they arrived, the kids ran to greet them, some shy, some excited. Sandra immediately knelt to talk to them, her face glowing with warmth. Keanu stood back at first, watching her. She had this natural ease with people, this ability to make them feel seen. When a little girl offered him a hand-painted seashell, he smiled, took it gently, and said, "Thank you." "It's beautiful." The girl grinned and ran off. A volunteer nearby whispered, "She's never spoken to a guest before." "You must have done something right." Keanu smiled faintly. "Maybe she just felt safe." As the day went on, they watched the children perform a small play. It was simple, full of mistakes, but pure. The kind of honesty only kids could create. Sandra's eyes filled with tears when one of the kids forgot his lines and the others helped him remember. Keanu noticed and smiled softly. When the performance ended, the children gathered around them for pictures. One of the kids asked innocently, "Are you two married?" Everyone laughed, including the volunteers. Sandra blushed. "No, sweetheart," she said with a smile. "We're just friends," Keanu added gently. "But very good friends." The boy nodded seriously, as if that made perfect sense. Later, as they left the center, the sun was beginning to set. The sky was painted in shades of orange and gold. Sandra was quiet, walking beside him. Finally, she said, "Those kids. They made me feel something I haven't felt in a long time." "What's that?" he asked. "Hope," she said simply. He nodded. "Yeah, they remind you what matters." As they walked along the beach road, their reflections stretched across the golden sand. The air smelled of sea and warmth. Everything felt still. Then Sandra said quietly, "You ever think about what comes next? After all this?" Keanu thought for a moment. "Maybe peace," he said. "Real peace. Not fame, not money, just peace." She smiled faintly. "You sound like someone who's already found it." He shook his head. "Not yet. But maybe I'm learning how." She stopped walking and looked at him seriously. "And if you find it, don't keep it to yourself." He looked back at her, his voice steady. "Then maybe we'll find it together." Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she didn't look away. There was something in that silence, something that neither of them dared to name yet, but both could feel. As the wind blew gently and the waves rolled against the shore, they kept walking side by side, their footsteps matching perfectly, like a rhythm that had always been waiting to begin. The unspoken truth, the next morning, brought with it the calm sound of the ocean, waves crashing softly against the rocks near the hotel. Keanu sat by the window, watching the horizon as sunlight painted the sky in shades of gold. He had barely slept, not because of stress, but because of thoughts that refused to rest. He couldn't stop replaying yesterday. The laughter of the children, the way Sandra's eyes glowed when she smiled, and the quiet words they had shared on the beach. There was something different about her now. Not new, exactly, but clearer. As if the light around her had changed. He took a deep breath and stood up. He was supposed to meet her for breakfast before they headed back to Los Angeles. When he entered the dining area, he saw her sitting near the window, a book in her hand, hair gently swaying in the breeze. She looked peaceful, unaware of the world around her. When she noticed him, her face lit up instantly. "You're late," she teased. "I needed a few extra minutes to think," he said, sitting across from her. "Thinking too much is dangerous," she said. Smiling. "So is feeling too much," he replied softly. Her smile faded slightly, but her eyes didn't move from his. There was something in his tone, not flirtation, not playfulness, but something real, something that made her heartbeat slow down for a moment. They ordered breakfast, but neither of them touched the food for a while. Silence filled the space between them, heavy yet gentle. Finally, Sandra said quietly, "Keanu, can I ask you something personal?" He nodded. "You can ask me anything. Do you ever regret not settling down?" The question caught him off guard. He looked at her, searching for words. "I think about it sometimes," he said slowly. "But life has a strange way of taking things away before you can reach for them. I learned to live with what's left." She nodded, her eyes softening. "You've lost so much," she said quietly. "And yet you still managed to stay kind." He smiled faintly. "Kindness isn't about what you have. It's about what you choose to give." Her gaze lingered on him, thoughtful, admiring. "That's why people trust you. You never pretend." He looked down at his coffee, his voice almost a whisper. "Maybe that's why I get lonely too." She didn't respond. Instead, she reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. It was a small gesture, but the warmth in that touch was enough to break through the wall he had built around himself. He didn't pull away. He just looked at her. Their eyes locked, a silence deeper than words surrounding them. Before either could say more, a hotel staff member approached with a message. "Miss Bullock, there's a call for you in the lobby," the woman said politely. Sandra nodded and excused herself. Keanu watched her leave, her hand slipping away slowly from his. When she disappeared around the corner, he sat there quietly, his thoughts heavy but calm. 15 minutes later, she returned, her expression different, quieter, distant. "Everything okay?" he asked. She hesitated, then sighed. "That was my agent. There's a film offer. Shooting starts next month in Italy." "That's good news," he said gently, though something inside him tightened. "Yeah," she said, but her tone lacked excitement. "It's a great project, but I'm not sure if I want to do it." He frowned slightly. "Why not?" She took a deep breath. "Because for the first time in a long while I feel still, like I don't have to chase something. And I don't want to lose that." He understood exactly what she meant. Fame had a way of stealing your peace even when it gave you everything else. "Maybe," he said softly, "you don't have to choose between the two." "How?" she asked. "By doing it your way," he said. "Not for the world, not for the cameras, just for you." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she smiled. "You always make it sound simple." "It's not simple," he said quietly. "But it's real." They finished breakfast in silence. Afterward, they checked out and got into the car for the drive back to Los Angeles. For the first hour, the ride was quiet. The ocean faded behind them, replaced by long stretches of highway. Sandra leaned against the seat, staring out the window. She seemed lost in thought. Keanu glanced at her once, then again, as if trying to read what she wasn't saying. Finally, she spoke. "Can I tell you something strange?" He smiled. "Please do." "When I fell asleep on your shoulder that night," she began softly, "it felt safe. I can't remember the last time I felt that." "Not with anyone." Keanu didn't speak. His hands tightened slightly on his knees. "It's like," she continued, "I didn't have to be the strong one. I didn't have to talk or explain. I just rested. And that scared me a little." He turned to her. "Why scared?" "Because I don't want to depend on anyone," she said. "And yet that moment, it reminded me that maybe it's okay to let someone in sometimes." His voice was steady, almost a whisper. "It is." They drove in silence for a long time after that. The road stretched endlessly ahead and the sky grew brighter. When they finally reached the city, the noise returned. Traffic, voices, chaos. The spell of peace they had shared seemed to fade with every passing mile. The car stopped outside Sandra's house. She turned to him before getting out. "Thank you, Keanu," she said softly. "For this trip." "For everything," he nodded. "Thank you for the silence," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. She smiled back. "Most people run from silence. Maybe that's why they never hear what really matters," he replied. She hesitated, as if wanting to say more, but then she just opened the door and stepped out. Before walking away, she leaned down slightly, her voice low. "Don't disappear again." He looked at her surprised. "I'll try not to." She smiled once more, then turned and walked toward her house. He watched her until the door closed behind her. As the car pulled away, Keanu leaned back against the seat. His heart was calm, but his mind was full. Something had begun to grow, quiet, steady, and real. It wasn't love in the loud, obvious sense. It was something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. A connection that didn't need words to exist. And as the city lights came into view, he realized something simple, yet powerful. Maybe peace wasn't found in solitude after all. Maybe it lived in the spaces between two people who understood each other without having to say a single thing. The distance between Heart's days turned into weeks after that quiet goodbye outside Sandra's home. Life, as it always did, returned to its usual rhythm. Meetings, interviews, cameras, lights, and long hours that blurred into each other. Keanu went back to filming while Sandra prepared for her new project overseas. Yet somewhere deep beneath the surface of both their routines, a quiet absence began to grow, the kind that didn't scream, but lingered softly like an echo that refused to fade. Keanu's mornings were still calm, but they didn't feel the same. He would wake up early, make coffee, and stare at the window longer than before. Sometimes he caught himself expecting a message, a small text, a random call, anything. But his phone stayed silent. He didn't blame her. He knew the world they lived in, a world where people drifted apart, even when they didn't mean to. Still, every time he saw the ocean in the distance, he thought of her laughter by the waves, her hair blowing in the wind, her words about peace. One evening, after finishing a late interview, Keanu was walking back to his car when a journalist asked casually, "There's a rumor, Mr. Reeves, that you and Sandra might be working together again. Any truth to that?" Keanu paused, offering a polite smile. "We haven't talked about it yet," he said gently. "But she's one of the few people I'd always say yes to." The interviewer laughed. "That sounds like something more than just friendship." He didn't answer, just smiled and walked away. Sometimes silence was easier than trying to explain feelings that didn't fit into headlines. Meanwhile, Sandra was in Italy, surrounded by beautiful landscapes and golden light. The movie she was shooting was emotional, a story about loss, love, and rediscovery. Maybe that was why every line she delivered reminded her of Keanu, the way he listened, the calm in his voice, the quiet strength in his silence. One night, after shooting a difficult scene, she sat alone on the balcony of her hotel room. The city lights shimmered below, and she suddenly felt a familiar pull, the same peace she had felt when she rested her head on his shoulder that rainy night. She picked up her phone, hesitated for a long time, then finally typed a message. "Hi, I saw a story today that reminded me of you. How have you been?" She hit send and waited. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed. "Still quiet," the reply said. "And you?" She smiled faintly. "Trying to find quiet in chaos," she wrote back. He responded almost instantly. "You'll find it." "You always do." Their conversation continued that night. Short messages, simple words, but full of warmth. They talked about work, travel, the ocean, and the strange comfort of missing someone without needing to explain why. For the next few weeks, their messages became a routine. Sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning, always gentle, never heavy. They didn't talk about what they were to each other, only about what they felt, a calm connection that didn't demand more than presence. But one evening, during a press event, a reporter asked Sandra a question that caught her off guard. "You and Keanu share such chemistry. People online call you soulmates. Do you think there's truth to that?" The crowd laughed softly, waiting for her answer. She smiled gracefully, but inside, her chest tightened. "Keanu," she said, is one of the kindest people I've ever known. We understand each other in silence. That's rare, the audience clapped, thinking it was just a sweet response. But when she looked down at the floor for a moment longer than usual, a part of her knew it was more than that. Later that night, she messaged him again. They asked about you today, she wrote. What did you say? He replied, that we understand each other in silence. That's true, he sent back. And it's enough. She stared at those words for a long time. Was it really enough? Or were they both just too afraid to want more? A few days later, Sandra's film wrapped. She stayed an extra night in Italy before flying home. She decided to send him something small, a picture she took at sunset with the message, "Reminded me of that day by the ocean." Keanu saw it while sitting in his car outside a studio. The sky was gray, but the photo glowed warm on his screen. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he just stared at it, lost in memory. Later that night, he finally sent back, "Beautiful," just like the silence that day. After that, the messages slowed, not because they wanted them to, but because life once again got in the way. Commitments, travel, exhaustion. Everything began to pull them back into separate worlds. Weeks passed. One rainy night, Keanu received a small envelope at his home. Inside was a simple postcard, an image of an Italian coastline and a single handwritten line. Peace is never a place, it's a person. There was no name, but he didn't need one. He smiled, holding the card gently, his thumb tracing the edge of her handwriting. He placed the postcard on his desk next to a photo of the ocean he had taken years ago. And every morning, when he sat by that desk with his coffee, he looked at it. A quiet reminder of something that still lived, even across distance. Days turned into months, and the world kept spinning. But sometimes, in the middle of his busy life, Keanu would pause. And in those moments, he could almost hear her voice again, calm, kind, and full of that rare stillness they had shared once upon a rainy night. When silence turns into words, months passed quietly as if time itself had learned to move slower between them. Keanu and Sandra had fallen back into their separate worlds again. Worlds that demanded smiles, appearances, and schedules. Yet, beneath all of it, something still connected them like a thin, invisible thread. It wasn't love in the way movies showed it. It wasn't even a promise. It was simply a quiet knowing that somewhere out there, someone understood them without needing to ask why. But life, as always, had a way of testing even the quietest connections. One evening, Keanu was invited to an award ceremony in Los Angeles. It was a big night. Cameras flashing, reporters shouting, fans cheering. He walked down the carpet in his usual calm manner, dressed in black, his expression kind but distant. He had learned long ago how to smile without showing too much. Inside the hall, the event buzzed with energy. Laughter, applause, speeches. It was the same familiar world. But as he sat at his table, his gaze drifted toward the entrance, where the doors suddenly opened. And there she was. Sandra Bullock, glowing under the golden light. Her dress simple, but graceful. She smiled politely at the cameras, but when her eyes found his across the room, her smile changed, softer, real, quiet. For the first time that evening, Keanu felt something inside him ease. When the ceremony ended, people rushed to greet them both, asking for photos, quotes, and memories of their famous movie together. The noise was loud, but their eyes kept finding each other across the crowd. Later, in the quieter lobby after most people had left, Sandra walked toward him slowly. "You didn't tell me you'd be here," she said softly. He smiled. "I didn't know you would be either." "Maybe it's the universe," she said, half smiling. "It likes coincidences," he chuckled. "Or maybe it's just time catching up with us." They found a corner table near the back, away from the crowd. The soft hum of distant chatter surrounded them, but between them, there was only silence. The same kind of silence that had started it all. After a few minutes, Sandra spoke. "I've missed this," she said quietly. "This?" he asked, the quiet, the way you make it feel safe. He looked at her gently. "I've missed it too." She smiled, but there was something in her eyes, a hint of sadness. maybe even fear. "Keanu," she began, "do you ever wonder what we're doing? I mean, at this thing between us. It's always there, always calm, but never spoken." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down, thinking. "I wonder," he said finally, "if maybe it doesn't need to be spoken. But don't you ever want to?" She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at her then, his eyes soft and honest. "Every day." The words hung in the air, simple, unpolished, true. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. All the years of understanding, of distance, of quiet respect. Suddenly it all led here, to this one still moment where everything unspoken finally found a voice. Sandra reached across the table and took his hand. "Then maybe it's time we stop running from it," she said gently. Keanu didn't move for a second. Then, slowly, he turned his hand and held hers, firm but tender. "I don't run," he said quietly. "I just wait for the right moment." "And this?" she asked, her eyes glistening. "Is this the moment?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe it's the beginning of one." They sat there, holding hands, saying nothing more. The world around them moved on. Laughter, music, clinking glasses. But their world had gone still. And in that stillness, something beautiful bloomed. Not loud or dramatic, but gentle and steady. Like the ocean tide that always returned no matter how far it went. The night ended, but neither of them wanted to leave. They walked outside together into the cool air, the city lights glowing softly around them. "You remember that night in the rain?" she asked suddenly. "How could I forget?" he said. "You held on to me," she said. "You didn't say anything, but somehow I knew everything." He looked at her, his voice calm. "Some things don't need to be said twice." She smiled, a tear slipping quietly down her cheek. "You're still the same. And you're still the peace I never knew I needed," he said softly. For a long time, they stood there under the streetlight, neither speaking, both smiling faintly. The air between them was full, not of tension, but of understanding. Finally, Sandra whispered, "What happens now?" Keanu thought for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. "Now," he said, "we stop waiting for perfect moments. We make them." She nodded, her eyes shining. "Together?" he smiled. "Together." And in that quiet promise, no grand speeches, no crowd, no cameras, something finally settled inside both of them. The distance that had once stood between their hearts simply disappeared, replaced by a calm certainty that this connection, born out of silence, had finally found its voice. Weeks later, the news quietly spread that Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock were working together again. A small, heartfelt film about finding peace in unexpected places. They didn't confirm or deny it. They didn't need to, because the truth wasn't in the headlines. It was in the way they looked at each other on set. It was in the comfort of shared silence, the warmth of small smiles, and the ease of two souls who no longer needed to pretend. And one evening, after a long day of filming, as they sat by the sea once more, the same sea that had witnessed their beginning, Sandra leaned her head on his shoulder again. Keanu smiled softly, closing his eyes. No lightning, no storm, no fear this time. Just peace, real, lasting peace.